I am going to discuss about an article called "The Parking Lot Suicides." As already seen in the subtitle, the point of this article is to criticize how the Department of Veteran Affairs failed to assist veterans with PTSD under their care who committed suicide, and how their deaths could have been prevented. To understand what is the viewpoint of the author in regards to this criticism, we focus on one of the techniques of creating the fiction, which is showing and not telling. This technique, which is represented here by a constant usage of codes to directly describe the conflict from the lenses of its victims, speaks by, speaks by itself. The author chooses not to describe them nor add a subjective reading of its meaning. As seen here, my son hears his country well, contrast to like how the countries serve the son. This is a quote of like one of the father's victims, and this technique is used to convey a message that is absent of interpretation. It creates a stronger emotional effect on the reader as it directly links the reader to the victims, and it's not the author who's saying that the department has failed, but it is the victims that are expressing how the department ruined their lives. However, we can also argue that this is not an absolute impartiality or unbiased on the issue, as the author is selecting what quotes to present and what quotes not to by what is known as selectivity. And also, not all the quotes are directly related to the fact that we're discussing, nor the suicide, nor how the department has failed. For example, this quote is more related to like it is more related to add context to the lives of one of the victims. It is not directly related to the veteran affairs case, and it is manipulating the interpretative lens of the audience by showing emotional information in order to create a stronger bond between the described victim and the reader. The victim could have been one of the readers in different circumstances. Therefore, it shows that the author's selectivity of information is skewed to ensure an emotional impact on the audience. This is further emphasized by seeing how the medium itself, the article, kind of like tries to suggest context but also in a biased way. There is the medium directs the reader to an external article that shows how Trump has failed to improve the veteran affairs. This provides extra context to persuade the reader into the arguments of the department's failure, suggesting a bias of the channel itself. Therefore, I had to look for external context to prevent being biased by this information. And I found, for example, that this quote that they mentioned about how Miller failed to use the crisis hotline is not something that is only present in this article, but the crisis hotline failed to assist thousands of veterans that wanted to ask for help through the Department of Veteran Affairs. Also, the article, after the first reading, I was wondering because the article presents the suicide as both a conscious act of protest against veteran affairs and an individual decision to stop living. Here, they explain how one of the victims, as most of them, were under substance abuse, depression, and anxiety after undergoing traumas of PTSD. However, it does not make sense, or it does not add up like the idea of consciously thinking of protesting as taking your own life as a sense of protest and going through all these kind of like mental illness problems that can like impair one's judgment. Therefore, I initially could not understand this and I thought they were mutually exclusive. However, I tried perhaps to understand if this was based on my interpretative lenses and there were biases of how I understand it. Therefore, I identified individual interpretative bias, which is that I'm primed by the multimodal class to over-criticize and try to see how the author may have been biased or impartially presenting the information untruthfully. And also, I have I'm also part of an interpretative community, as my society avoids talking about suicide, and I was raised absorbing the belief that suicide is a selfish act that one ultimately does for oneself. Thus, the context of process sounded wrong, and I doubted it. However, I tried looking up for context and understand really what suicide means. I looked up for different philosophical movements. Albert Camus, for example, said that killing oneself is a confession. It is a personal act, but often triggered by something external. And existentialists say that suicide is seldom a rational act, but most often it is an act of an uncontrollable anguish of despair that is triggered by something external of the environment. Thus, this supports the idea that the suicide may have been prevented, but not that it was in a sign of protest, but just in a sign of stopping their existences. And maybe it connoted a failure of the department. However, this illustrates a plausible interpretive lens of the author, as her prior expectations to criticize the Department of Veteran Affairs may advise her to showcase the suicides as against something else, when they are actually an end in itself to show absolute loss of hope. They did not kill themselves to send a message, but they did so because they were in pain, misery, and they wanted to stop it.